The land lay quiet beneath a gray sky, the kind of silence that presses against the chest until a man can hear his own blood moving. Snow drifted in restless spirals over the plains, and upon that wide white emptiness rode a solitary figure. Elias Boone, age 30, carried his bulk like a burden. He was a giant of a cowboy, broad-shouldered and heavy with the weight of years that had given him nothing but loneliness. His coat, patched and faded, clung to him like the memory of choices he could not undo. People once called him a protector, but that was before he failed to keep his own family safe. Since then, he had ridden without destination, with only silence to answer his grief. The horse beneath him gave a soft snort as Elias pulled the reins and slowed. Across the horizon, smoke rose in thin gray columns, faint but certain. Smoke out here, on the winter flats, meant something had been disturbed. He narrowed his eyes, that deep-set gaze that always seemed to weigh the world, and listened. No wind stirred, no animal scurried. Only the snow, falling and falling, as though burying secrets. A question prickled at the edges of his mind. What would he find at the end of that smoke? And why did his heart beat harder, as though it already knew the answer? He rode closer, the crunch of hooves muffled in the snow. Soon the smoke dissipated into nothing, but what reached him instead was sound, faint, almost swallowed by the stillness. A cry. Soft, thin, like a prayer torn ragged by the cold. He dismounted, boots sinking heavy into the snow. The sound drew him to an old well, its stones crooked and rimmed with frost. And there, lashed cruelly against the stonework, was a woman. Her name he did not yet know, but she was Ayoka, age 20, and she looked as though carved from the marrow of the land itself. Her hair, long and black, fell in tangled waves over her bound shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed from the bitter air, her wrists raw from rope. Yet her eyes, dark, alive, held no surrender. She glared at him as though daring him to be yet another captor. Beauty radiated from her not as softness but as fire, a fierce defiance that seemed to shame the ropes themselves. Elias froze where he stood. He had not expected to see another soul, much less a woman bound in the open cold like a warning left by cruel hands. He had failed once to protect those he loved. Could he risk failing again? His breath clouded the air as his great hands moved to the knots, clumsy, too rough for the delicate task. The ropes bit stubborn, and his silence pressed between them like another wall. She watched him without a word, suspicion sharp in her gaze. When the last knot fell free, her knees buckled, though she fought to stand. He caught her lightly, guiding her against the stone. For a moment he felt her shiver through his gloves, a tremor that seeped into him like an echo. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again. Words never came easy for a man who had carried silence too long. The air shifted. A sound, faint yet unmistakable, the approach of horses. Elias lifted his head, scanning the horizon. Figures blurred by snow drew nearer, dark on white. Bandits. The ones who had left her here. He clenched his jaw, a man who had lived too long trying not to fight. Yet now the choice was clear. Stand or turn away. He stepped forward, planting his boots deep, placing his body between Ayoka and the approaching riders. The men arrived with laughter that cut against the still air. They circled, wolves with human faces, their voices coarse with the pleasure of cruelty. "Step aside, cowboy," one sneered, his rifle slung low. They mocked Elias' silence, though in truth it was that silence that unsettled them most. He did not speak, only leveled his gaze, wide-shouldered and unmovable. Elias lifted his rifle, hands steady despite the thunder of his heart. Ayoka, still weak, pressed herself against the stone of the well, watching with a tension that was not fear but a testing of him. The bandits closed in, their bravado thinning under the giant's quiet. Finally Elias fired, not at them, but into the snow at their feet. The shot cracked the silence, spraying frost. The bandits startled, and for a breath the spell broke. They spat curses, circled once more, then pulled back, muttering of better prey elsewhere. When they were gone, Elias turned to Ayoka. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes still ablaze. He extended a hand, awkward, hesitant. She did not take it. Instead she lifted her chin, meeting him not as a victim but as one weighing whether to trust. For a moment, he thought she would walk into the cold alone. Yet when he led his horse forward, she stepped beside him, pride stiff but will bending to survival. He lifted her onto the saddle, then swung up behind her. She stiffened at the closeness, but said nothing. The storm gathered around them, snow swallowing the horizon. Each hoofbeat carried them further into wilderness. Her hair, loose and heavy, brushed against his chest with the rhythm of the ride. He tried not to notice, but his heart betrayed him with each brush. She, too, was silent, but her silence was different from his. Not the absence of words, but the guarding of them. Hours later, through the thick curtain of snow, Elias spotted the outline of an old cabin, half forgotten in the woods. He led the horse inside the sagging shelter, dismounted, then helped her down, his hands careful, though his size made gentleness clumsy. She pulled away quickly, standing on her own, breath rising white in the cold. Inside, the firelight flickered weakly. Elias set about gathering wood, splitting it with measured force. He draped his coat over her shoulders, though she resisted at first, before finally pulling it close. He noticed her wrists again, the raw skin where ropes had bitten. The sight cut him deeper than any bullet could have. He melted snow into water, pressed a tin cup into her hands. Their eyes met briefly. She lowered hers, but not before he caught the faintest tremor of softening. Night fell. The cabin creaked beneath the weight of snow. They sat apart, shadows stretching between them. She spoke at last, voice quiet but firm. Ayoka. Her name, offered like the first flame of a fire. Elias inclined his head once, the name searing into him with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. Days passed, bound in the cabin's silence. Elias worked without words, chopping wood, patching leak. Ayoka mended torn cloth, cleaned, kept herself busy with small acts of resilience. Shame hung over them both like a low cloud. He carried the shame of his past, she the shame of being bound and left as though worthless. Yet in small kindnesses, a cup handed, a blanket pulled close, a glance that lingered, something unspoken grew between them. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Elias spoke haltingly. He told her of the family he had failed, how guilt had driven him into the wilderness, a ghost among men. His voice broke once, rough as gravel. Ayoka listened, her dark eyes steady, as though she too had lived under judgment. When he fell silent, she touched his arm lightly, her hand small against his vast frame. It was not a declaration, but a gesture, and for Elias it was enough to undo him inside. A wolf howled outside, and both of them turned toward the sound. The wilderness was not done with them, and soon neither were the bandits. They returned on the third night, circling the cabin like vultures. Elias rose, rifle in hand, prepared to fall if need be. But Ayoka stepped beside him, her fingers brushing his, steadying him. Not a damsel, not a burden, but a partner. The bandits burst through the door, and the cabin erupted into struggle. Elias fought with grim restraint, every blow measured, every breath for her. Ayoka moved quick, seizing moments, distracting, striking when she could. Together, they forced the intruders back into the storm, where snow swallowed their curses. When silence returned, it was the silence of survival. They stood close, breath mingling, bodies trembling from exhaustion. Elias felt her hand still holding his. He looked down and for once did not look away. She lifted her other hand, brushing snow from his beard. The gesture was tender, unguarded. He lowered his head, pressing his brow gently to hers. No kiss, not yet, only the quiet surrender of two souls deciding, without words, to belong. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the earth in white. Inside, the fire held steady. And in that hush, Elias knew that the silence he carried might finally be broken, not by words, but by the life that would grow in the spaces between them. Years later, they would marry, raise children, and grow old together in that same cabin, their love quiet as snowfall but strong enough to outlast storms. But for now, they stood side by side, two scarred souls in a fragile peace, beginning again. And if you ask what love is, I will tell you this. Perhaps it does not arrive with thunder or grand declarations. Perhaps it comes instead with a hand that steadies you, a coat shared in the cold, the choice to remain when leaving would be easier. Perhaps love is the soft courage to stay.